The night my father-in-law died, my brother-in-law changed the Wi-Fi password before the body was even cold. I'm not exaggerating. My husband's father, we called him Pop, passed on a Tuesday afternoon in October. By Tuesday evening, I was standing in the kitchen of the house I had been living in for 3 years, this house where I had cooked every meal, driven Pop to every dialysis appointment, managed every insurance form, every prescription refill, every 3 a.m. call, when he couldn't breathe right, and my phone said incorrect password when I tried to connect. Small thing, you might say. Petty thing to notice when a man just died. But I noticed it, because I had learned, over 3 years of being in that family, that small things were never small. Small things were signals. I should back up. My name doesn't matter as much as the story does, but I'll tell you the part that does matter. I married into a family with money. Not obscene money. Not yacht and private Iceland money, but a nice house in a good neighborhood, an investment account, a lake property 2 hours north that Pop had been going to every summer since before my husband was born. Real, solid, Midwestern money. The kind that gets divided when someone dies. The kind that makes people into different versions of themselves. Pop had 2 sons. My husband. I'll call him my husband because that's what he is, and his older brother, who I will call my brother-in-law because that's all he ever really was to me. They were 12 years apart. My husband was the younger one, the one who ended up living close to home after we got married. The one who answered the phone at midnight when Pop's oxygen levels dropped. His brother lived 40 minutes away and made it to most holidays. Most. From the very beginning, I understood the dynamic without anyone explaining it to me. My brother-in-law was the golden son. Firstborn, law degree, big personality, the kind of guy who walked into a room and immediately became the loudest thing in it. His wife. My sister-in-law, I suppose, though she never felt like one, wore the kind of clothes that told you exactly how much they cost. They had 2 kids in private school. They had opinions about everything and doubts about nothing. And then there was us. My husband, an electrician. Me, working in hospital administration. We weren't struggling, but we weren't them. And somehow, in the architecture of that family, that difference had calcified into something permanent. My brother-in-law made decisions. We were informed of them afterward. The first time I noticed it really land on me was about a year after we moved in with Pop. His health had declined faster than anyone expected, and it made sense, logistically, emotionally, for us to be there. We gave up our apartment. We gave up the life we were building. We told each other it was temporary, that we'd figure out the next step once Pop was more stable. Pop was never really stable again after that, but we stayed. We didn't think twice about it. My brother-in-law visited on Sundays usually. He'd bring pastries from a bakery downtown, sit in the living room with Pop for an hour, talk loudly about his cases and his kids' soccer tournaments and some renovation they were doing on their back deck. Then he'd leave, and I'd go back to the kitchen to make Pop's dinner, or to the bathroom to help him with his evening medications, or to the laundry room to deal with sheets that needed changing. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I'm telling you because it's true, and because the truth of it matters for what came later. Pop and I had a real relationship. That surprised me, honestly. He was old school in ways that should have made us strangers. He'd grown up in a house where women didn't have opinions about money, where you didn't talk about feelings, where you shook hands and showed up and kept your mouth shut about most things. But something about living together, about the intimacy, of being present through someone's hardest years, had broken open some wall in him. He told me things he didn't tell his sons. He told me about his wife, my husband's mother, who had died 15 years before I ever came into the picture, and how he still kept her reading glasses in his nightstand even though he couldn't explain why. He told me about mistakes he'd made as a father, about money he'd given my brother-in-law over the years that he'd never quite felt right about the lake house, and how much it meant to him, and who he'd always imagined enjoying it someday. I listened. I didn't advise. I didn't push. I just sat with him in the evenings when my husband was on a long job, and Pop couldn't sleep, and we watched old game shows and he talked and I listened, and somewhere in there, without either of us making a formal announcement of it, we became people who genuinely cared about each other. His youngest grandchild, our daughter, who had just turned 7, called him Grandpop. She was the only grandchild who'd ever called him that. The others called him Grandpa, which was fine, which was normal, but she'd invented Grandpop herself at age 3 and he had loved it so much that his face changed every time she said it. He kept a photo of her on his nightstand next to his late wife's reading glasses. I want you to hold that image, because it matters. Pop passed on a Tuesday in October, like I said. It wasn't sudden, we'd known it was coming for months, but it was still a blow when it happened. My husband was there, I was there. We called my brother-in-law, who arrived about an hour later with his wife, who cried loudly and hugged everyone and said, "He's at peace," several times in a row. The funeral home came. The house felt different the moment the car pulled away. That's when the Wi-Fi changed. I noticed it that evening when I tried to look something up on my phone. I asked my brother-in-law about it, casually, the way you'd ask about anything mundane in the middle of grief. He said he'd updated it for security. New password was something he'd text me. He never texted me. My husband didn't think much of it. He was devastated and exhausted, and I didn't want to pile onto his grief with what might be nothing. So I let it go. But I watched. Over the following week, my brother-in-law was in the house almost constantly. Not grieving, exactly, moving. opening cabinets, looking at things, picking things up, and setting them back down in slightly different places. He had a long phone call I caught the tail end of, once, where he mentioned the property assessment and having someone come look at it. When I asked my husband what that was about, my husband said he didn't know. Pop's attorney called 2 weeks after the funeral to schedule the reading of the will. My brother-in-law handled the call, which I thought was strange. He reported back that it would be at the house the following Saturday, with just immediate family. Saturday came. The attorney arrived, a dry, unhurried man in his 60s, who set his briefcase on Pop's dining room table, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had done this many times and did not intend to be rushed. My husband and I sat on one side of the table. My brother-in-law and his wife sat on the other. His 2 kids were somewhere in the house, I could hear them. My daughter was upstairs in the room she'd slept in for the last 3 years. The one with the purple curtains Pop had let her pick out herself. The attorney opened the file. He said something about this being the last will and testament. All the legal language, and then he began. Pop had left the financial accounts, the investment portfolio, the savings, divided between his 2 sons, split evenly. Fine, expected. My brother-in-law visibly relaxed when he heard that part. Then the attorney said, the lake property. My brother-in-law leaned forward slightly. I had seen that lean before. That was the lean of someone who already knew what was coming and was just waiting to hear it confirmed out loud. The attorney said the lake property was to be transferred in full to me, not to my husband. To me by name. The room went completely silent, not to the household, not split between the sons, to me specifically in my name. My brother-in-law said slowly, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? The attorney repeated it. Then he produced a handwritten letter, which he said Pop had left with the document 3 years ago and updated 6 months before his death. The attorney asked if he should read it aloud. My husband looked at me. I nodded. Pop's handwriting was careful and old-fashioned, the kind of penmanship nobody has anymore. The attorney read it slowly. Pop wrote that over the last 3 years, he had watched his daughter-in-law give up her home, her time, her sleep, and her own life, to make sure he could stay in his house and die with dignity. He wrote that no one had asked her to do that. He wrote that he had seen her hold his hand during treatments, when she could have been anywhere else. He wrote that she had never once asked him for anything, or reminded him of anything she'd given up, and that this was so rare in his experience of people, that it had changed how he thought about what it meant to love someone. He wrote that the lake property had always been the thing he cared about most in the world after his family. And that she was his family. He wrote, tell my boys I love them, but she earned this, and she should know I knew it. My brother-in-law stood up before the attorney finished the last sentence. He said, it wasn't legal. He said Pop wasn't competent in his last years. He said he wanted to contest it. He said a lot of things, actually, loudly and fast, the way he said most things. His wife put her hand on his arm and he shook it off. My husband was crying quietly. He reached over and took my hand under the table. He didn't say anything, neither did I. The attorney waited until my brother-in-law had finished. Then he said, without any particular emotion, that Pop had worked with his office for 31 years, that the will had been drafted and updated multiple times, and that the most recent update had been made 6 months prior to Pop's death, at which point a cognition assessment had been conducted and documented as a standard precaution given Pop's age and medical history. He said he had anticipated a challenge and had prepared accordingly. He set a second folder on the table. My brother-in-law's voice changed. It got quieter. The attorney explained that the assessment had been scheduled by Pop himself without anyone's knowledge, because Pop had wanted it documented that he was of sound mind when he made this decision. Pop had apparently told the attorney that he'd expected it to be contested. He'd used the word anticipated. I sat there with my husband's hand in mine, and I thought about all the Sunday afternoons my brother-in-law had spent with his pastries and his loud voice and his stories about his renovation. I thought about the Wi-Fi password. I thought about my daughter's purple curtains upstairs. I thought about Pop in the evenings, watching game shows, telling me things he'd never said to anyone. He had known. He had been planning this. He had done everything right so that no one could take it away. My brother-in-law left before the attorney had even packed up his briefcase. His wife followed him, quietly, without making eye contact with anyone. I heard their car in the driveway and then the sound of it pulling away. The attorney finished his paperwork. He shook my husband's hand. He shook mine. He said that the transfer of the lake property would take 6 to 8 weeks, and that we should call his office if any complications arose. Then he left and the house was very quiet. My daughter came downstairs about 20 minutes later. She hadn't heard any of it. She'd been watching something on my tablet with her headphones on. She looked at my husband's red eyes and at my face, which I imagine looked like something between shock and grief, and she said, very seriously, is everything okay? My husband pulled her onto his lap. He said, Grandpop left you something. She frowned. She said, what did he leave me? He said, the lake. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, can we go in the summer? My husband laughed, the way you laugh when you've been crying, ragged and sudden and real. He said, yes, sweetheart, we can go in the summer. The weeks after that were not simple. My brother-in-law did consult another attorney. There were some letters exchanged. My husband handled most of it, or rather our attorney did. presenting the cognitive assessment, and the documented timeline, and the fact that Pop had updated that will. With counsel present. 6 months before his death. The challenge went nowhere. I don't think my brother-in-law actually believed it would work. I think he just needed to feel like he'd done something. We didn't speak to them for a long time after that. My husband reached out to his brother around the holidays, a short message, nothing demanding, and got a short message back. They exist now in that particular register of family, where you will occasionally be in the same room for someone's graduation or wedding, and you will be polite and careful and feel the exact shape of what you're not saying every second that you're together. I've made peace with that, mostly. What I haven't stopped thinking about is the letter. Pop wrote it 6 months before he died, when he must have known that the dialysis was buying time, but not changing the outcome, when he'd started having those quiet evenings, where he'd look out the window for a long time before he said anything. He had sat down with his attorney and signed that paper and then come home and made no mention of it. He had sat with me in the evenings after that, and watched game shows and talked about his wife's reading glasses and my daughter's purple curtains. And he'd known the whole time. I don't know why that moves me so much. Maybe because the only thing he asked of me, ever, was that I stay. And I had stayed without knowing there was any reason to stay, except that it was the right thing to do. And apparently that was exactly the point. The lake house is smaller than I'd imagined. 2 bedrooms, a dock that needs some work, a kitchen that smells like cedar, and something I can't identify but that my husband says smells like every summer of his childhood. We went up for the first time this past June. My daughter ran straight for the water before we'd even brought in the bags. I stood on the dock for a little while by myself. The lake was flat and very still, and the trees on the far side looked like they'd been painted there. I thought, he knew. I thought he wanted me to be here. And then my daughter yelled from the end of the dock, "Mom, can you see the bottom?" And I walked toward her voice, and I told her, "Yes, sweetheart, if you look right there, you can see the bottom." And she grabbed my hand and leaned over the edge of the dock to look, and I held on tight so she wouldn't fall. That's the whole story. That's all of it. Some people will hear it and say I got lucky. That's fine. Maybe I did. But I've thought about what luck means. About whether showing up at 3 a.m. About whether holding someone's hand through something hard. About whether choosing to stay when staying costs you something real is actually luck. Or whether it's just the kind of thing that doesn't have a word for it yet. Pop knew what it was. He found a way to say it. That was enough.